The ledger columns aligned perfectly, just as Randolph Cassidy preferred, every number in its place, every calculation precise. Through the mahogany-framed window of his office, he watched Settlers Ridge prepare for another spring, his spring, in a town his railroad had built. The knock interrupted his concentration. "Mr. Cassidy, the council meeting starts in 10 minutes. Randolph straightened his collar and reached for his hat. As mayor and primary investor, his attendance wasn't optional. Neither was his opinion, which the other men valued almost as much as his money. The schoolhouse stood 3 blocks away, its white paint still fresh from last summer. Randolph had funded the construction himself, believing education separated civilization from wilderness. A town with a proper school attracted the right kind of families. Inside, 20 men gathered around desks meant for children. Banker Morris called the meeting to order, but his attention kept drifting toward the woman seated in the back row, Ellen Hartwell, the new teacher. Widow, Boston trained, hired by the previous council in Randolph's absence. She'd arrived 2 weeks ago with trunks full of books and ideas that set tongues wagging from the mercantile to the saloon. "Gentlemen," Morris began, "we should address concerns about the school's new direction." Randolph stood without waiting for recognition. "I'll make this simple. I visited the classroom yesterday. What I saw was nonsense." He gestured toward Ellen without looking at her directly. Cushioned reading corners, nature specimens cluttering windowsills, children working in groups instead of rows. "Children need discipline, not coddling," he continued, his voice carrying the authority that came from building empires in unforgiving territory. "Structure, consequences." This frontier wasn't settled by soft men raising soft sons. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. These were ranchers, merchants, men who'd carved futures from hard ground. They understood Randolph's language. Ellen Hartwell remained seated, hands folded in her lap. She didn't argue or defend herself. Her composure unnerved him more than protest would have. Those steady gray eyes suggested she'd heard such speeches before and knew how they ended. "Mrs. Hartwell," Morris said carefully, "would you like to respond?" She stood with quiet grace. "Different methods serve different children. Gentlemen, I'm happy to discuss my approach with any parent who asks." Her voice was gentle but clear, like water over stones. "The results will speak for themselves." The meeting continued another hour, but Randolph's mind had already moved past it. He'd stated his position. The other fathers nodded agreement. Traditional methods had served them well enough. Walking back to his office, he noticed lamplights still burning in the schoolhouse windows. Ellen Hartwell, undeterred by council disapproval, preparing tomorrow's lessons. Randolph settled behind his desk and returned to his ledgers. Everything in its proper column, everything balanced. Outside, the late winter wind rattled the window frame, and somewhere in the growing dark, ice began its slow surrender to spring. The numbers blurred slightly. He blinked hard and started the calculations again. Ellen stood in the schoolyard 3 days later, watching children scatter toward home. Most ran laughing, but one boy lingered 10 years old, shoulders hunched against more than cold wind. Thomas Cassidy. She'd noticed him the first week. Bright eyes that dimmed whenever books appeared. Hands that trembled when called to read aloud. "Thomas," she called gently. A moment. The boy approached like a prisoner approaching judgment. Ellen knelt to his level, ignoring the mud soaking her skirt hem. "You're not in trouble," she said. "I want to show you something." She led him inside to a table spread with wooden blocks, each carved with numbers. "Try building me a train. Engine first, then 3 cars. His face brightened. Hands that fumbled with pencils moved surely with wood. Within minutes, he'd constructed a precise model, counting blocks without seeming to notice he was doing mathematics. "You see numbers as pictures," Ellen said. "That's not wrong. Thomas, it's just different." The door opened. Randolph Cassidy filled the frame, jaw tight with suspicion. Thomas, wait outside. The boy fled. Ellen stood slowly, wiping mud from her skirt. Mr. Cassidy, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to discuss Thomas's progress. My son doesn't need discussing. Randolph's voice could cut steel. He needs to apply himself harder. He applies himself plenty, Ellen said. But he learns differently than the previous teacher's methods allowed. I'd like to tutor him after school, no charge, 3 afternoons weekly. Randolph's spine stiffened as though she'd insulted his lineage. My boy doesn't need special treatment. Mrs. Hartwell, what he needs is discipline, not excuses. I'm offering education, not excuses. You're offering to coddle a child who simply needs to try harder. He stepped closer, using height as authority. My father raised me with strict standards. Those standards made me the man I am. Thomas will learn the same way through effort and consequence. Ellen met his eyes without flinching. Different methods serve different children. Mr. Cassidy, the offer stands when you're ready. He left without responding, collecting Thomas from the yard with a hand that gripped the boy's shoulder too tightly. That evening, Randolph sat in his study while Thomas struggled through arithmetic homework. The boy's pencil scratched and paused. Scratched and paused. Numbers wandered across the slate in crooked rows. Start again, Randolph said. You're not concentrating. Thomas erased everything with shaking hands. A tear slid down his cheek, absorbed quickly by his sleeve. Randolph felt something shift in his chest doubt, perhaps, or the first crack in certainty's foundation. His son wasn't lazy. The boy tried until exhaustion dimmed his eyes. But admitting the teaching method might be wrong meant admitting he'd been wrong. About education. About what his son needed. About the rigid discipline he'd considered love's truest expression. He closed that crack with familiar mortar. 2 more problems before bed. And tomorrow, you'll spend an extra hour on reading. Thomas nodded without speaking. The scratch of pencil on slate filled the silence like accusation. Outside, night settled over Settlers Ridge. In the schoolhouse, Ellen Hartwell prepared individual learning plans by lamplight, writing each child's name with careful attention. When she reached Thomas Cassidy, she paused, then wrote spatial learner, needs visual models, thrives with patient guidance. She didn't write what she knew to be equally true, that the boy was drowning, and his father couldn't see the water. Thomas appeared at his father's study door near midnight. Randolph looked up from railroad contracts, surprised to find the boy still awake. Papa, I need to say something. The tremor in his son's voice pulled Randolph's full attention. Thomas rarely initiated conversation, especially about difficult subjects. Go ahead. Please let Mrs. Hartwell teach me. The words tumbled out in a rush. I'm not stupid, Papa. I can't learn the way Mr. Peterson taught. I try so hard. But the letters move around and the numbers don't make sense when he explains them. Please. Randolph set down his pen. His son stood in the doorway in a nightshirt, bare feet on cold floorboards, desperation written in every line of his small frame. You're not stupid, Randolph said quietly. Don't ever think that. Then why can't I learn? Thomas's voice broke. Everyone else understands. But when I try to read out loud, they laugh. When I can't solve problems fast enough, Mr. Peterson makes me stand in the corner. I hate school. Papa, I hate feeling dumb every single day. The words landed like physical blows. Randolph rose and crossed to his son, kneeling to meet his eyes. You're not dumb. Thomas. Then let her help me, please. Randolph pulled his son into an embrace, feeling the boy's thin shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. Rachel would have known what to do. His wife had possessed an instinct for nurturing that Randolph lacked. After her death in childbirth, he'd compensated the only way he knew, through structure. Discipline. Unwavering standards. He'd believed that making Thomas strong meant being hard first. That preparation for a harsh world required harshness at home. Love expressed through expectations rather than softness. But his son's tears suggested otherwise. "All right," he heard himself say, "3 afternoons a week with Mrs. Hartwell." Thomas pulled back, eyes wide. "Really? On one condition, if I see coddling instead of teaching. It stops immediately." "Understood." "Yes, sir, thank you, Papa," after Thomas returned to bed. Randolph stood at his study window. The town lay quiet under stars bright enough to cast shadows. Somewhere out there, Ellen Hartwell slept in the boarding house, probably never doubting her methods would prove superior. The thought rankled. He'd granted permission out of love for his son, not conviction in her philosophy. He'd watch closely, ready to pull Thomas out at the first sign that gentle methods meant lowered standards. The next afternoon, Randolph appeared at the schoolhouse after dismissal. Ellen looked up from arranging books. "Mr. Cassidy, Thomas will accept your tutoring offer. 3 afternoons weekly, starting Monday." "I'm very glad." Her smile held no triumph, only genuine warmth. "He's a bright boy who needs someone to speak his language. I'll be monitoring his progress closely." "I'd expect nothing less." She gestured to the materials spread across her desk blocks. Picture cards, journals with blank pages. "Would you like me to explain my approach?" "Just teach him to read and calculate properly. That's all I need to understand." Ellen nodded slowly. "I promise you'll see learning." "Mr. Cassidy, real learning. That's all I offer, a different path to the same destination." He left before she could say more. Walking back to his office, he noticed the creek behind the schoolhouse. Ice still covered most of its surface, but along the edges, water ran free. Spring approached whether anyone was ready or not. That night, Thomas asked 3 times if tutoring really started Monday. Each time, Randolph confirmed it, watching hope gradually overcome the fear of disappointment in his son's eyes. Randolph positioned his desk chair to face the window. From this angle, he could watch the schoolhouse entrance while appearing to work on correspondence. Monday afternoon, Thomas approached the building with his usual reluctance. By Wednesday, his steps came quicker. By the second week's Friday, the boy arrived early. Waiting on the steps for Ellen to unlock the door, Randolph told himself this proved nothing. Enthusiasm wasn't the same as learning. He watched through the glass, seeing only shapes and movement. Thomas at a table, Ellen beside him. Books in those peculiar wooden blocks. Sometimes they stood together at the chalkboard, Ellen pointing while Thomas nodded. No way to judge results from this distance. At home, changes accumulated like snow before an avalanche. Thomas mentioned a book about trains. Ellen had connected his father's railroad work to history lessons. He talked about using blocks to solve fraction problems, demonstrating with dinner rolls until Randolph told him to eat instead of play. Most surprising, Thomas asked to go to tutoring early on days when it wasn't scheduled. "Why?" Randolph demanded. "Mrs. Hartwell lets me help prepare materials for other students. I like organizing the science specimens." Randolph filed this information without comment. The boy enjoyed helping, but that didn't prove the academic value of unorthodox methods. He began researching Ellen Hartwell with the same thoroughness he applied to business investments. Her credentials were impeccable, graduated from a Boston teachers' college with honors, taught at a prestigious private academy before her husband's death. The references used terms like revolutionary patience and sees what others miss. One wrote, "Mrs. Hartwell possesses the rare gift of meeting children where they are rather than demanding. They come to her." This disturbed Randolph more than incompetence would have. She wasn't a charlatan or fool. Her different methods came from expertise, not ignorance, which meant if they worked, his traditional approach might actually be inferior. On the 3rd Friday, Randolph arrived early to collect Thomas. Through the window, he saw his son reading aloud, not stumbling through words, but actually reading with something approaching fluency. Ellen sat beside him, not interrupting constantly to correct, just listening with complete attention. When Thomas finished a paragraph, she asked, "What do you think the author means there?" Thomas considered, then answered thoughtfully, Ellen nodded and showed him how the same idea could be expressed differently, teaching him that reading meant thinking, not just reciting. Randolph stood frozen on the pathway, watching his son engage with text as if it held genuine interest rather than torture. When he finally entered, Thomas looked up with flushed cheeks. "Papa, I read 5 whole pages today." 5. "That's good, son." Ellen walked them to the door. Thomas has a gift for visual learning. When he can see concepts as pictures or models, comprehension comes naturally. "I see," Randolph said, though he didn't. Not really. "You're welcome to observe any time. Mr. Cassidy, understanding his learning style might help you support him at home." The suggestion felt like criticism, though her tone held no judgment. Randolph nodded stiffly and ushered Thomas into the cooling afternoon. That evening, Thomas asked to read aloud before bed voluntarily, for the first time in his life. He chose a chapter from a book about locomotives, reading with careful concentration. When he finished, pride shone in his eyes. "Did I do okay, Papa?" "You did fine, son." Randolph lay awake long after Thomas slept. His methods had been failing. Ellen's were succeeding. The evidence was undeniable, but admitting this meant everything he'd believed about raising children was wrong. 6 weeks into tutoring, Randolph found himself at the schoolhouse window again. This time he made no pretense of accidental presence. He needed to see what was happening inside those walls. Thomas sat with a book, Ellen in the chair beside him, not hovering over him or correcting every hesitation. Just present, attentive, creating space for his son to think. Thomas read aloud, really read, with inflection and comprehension. He stumbled on a complex word, sounded it out carefully, got it right. Ellen smiled but didn't interrupt. When he finished the passage, she asked, "What's happening in this part of the story?" Thomas explained the plot with detail that proved genuine understanding. Then Ellen asked what he thought would happen next, and Thomas offered predictions based on character motivations and story logic. Randolph's hands clenched at his sides. When had his son become capable of this kind of analysis? How had he missed the transformation happening? Right before him, Ellen demonstrated how the same story could be told from different perspectives, teaching Thomas that reading meant entering another person's thoughts. That comprehension required imagination as much as decoding. The lesson continued another 20 minutes. Randolph watched his son lean forward with engagement, ask questions without fear, make connections between this book and others he'd read. When Thomas emerged, he didn't notice his father waiting in the shadows. The boy practically skipped down the pathway, clutching his book like treasure. That evening, Thomas appeared in the study doorway. "Papa, can I read to you?" Randolph set aside his work. "All right." Thomas settled into the chair across from him and opened a book about railroad engineering chosen. Randolph suspected, to appeal to his father's interests. For 30 minutes, the boy read aloud, explaining technical concepts with growing confidence. When he finished a full chapter, Thomas looked up expectantly. "What do you think?" "I think you've made remarkable progress. Mrs. Hartwell says I was always capable. I just needed someone to teach me in my language instead of making me translate theirs." The simple statement contained an accusation Randolph couldn't ignore. His son had always possessed this potential. His methods had buried it under shame and frustration. After Thomas went to bed, Randolph paced his office. The mahogany desk, the perfectly aligned ledgers, the ordered efficiency of his professional life, none of it helped solve this crisis. He'd been wrong about teaching, about what his son needed, about confusing harshness with love. Ellen Hartwell had succeeded where he'd failed, not through permissiveness, but through wisdom. She'd seen Thomas clearly, understood how his mind worked, and met him there. While Randolph had tried to force his son into a mold that didn't fit, the admission cost everything: his certainty, his ideology, his claim to have raised Thomas correctly. Pride warred with evidence, but the evidence was undeniable. His son came home excited about learning, smiled when discussing books, volunteered for extra study, demonstrated comprehension that had seemed impossible 2 months ago. Randolph crossed to the window. Lamplight still burned in the schoolhouse. Ellen, working late as always, preparing individual approaches for students who needed someone to see them as people rather than problems. He should be grateful. He should apologize. He should ask her to teach him what she knew. But gratitude required humility. An apology required admitting failure. And learning required becoming a student again. The ice on the creek had melted completely. Spring water ran fast and clear, carving new paths through winter's debris. Change came whether anyone was ready or not. Randolph stood at the window until the schoolhouse lamp finally went dark. The special school board meeting was called for a Tuesday evening. Randolph attended out of duty, expecting routine business about next year's budget. Instead, he walked into an ambush. 15 men filled the room, most of them fathers whose children attended the school. Banker Morris stood at the front, looking uncomfortable. "Gentlemen, we've received a petition regarding Mrs. Hartwell's teaching methods." He gestured to a document on the desk. 12 fathers have signed a request to replace her with a male teacher who will maintain proper discipline. Randolph's attention sharpened. He recognized most of the signatures ranchers and merchants who valued tradition over innovation. Luther Briggs, a rival rancher who'd always resented Randolph's success, stood to speak. This woman fills children's heads with nonsense. Group work instead of individual recitation. Picture books instead of proper texts. She's turning the school into a daycare. Several men nodded agreement. Randolph noticed none of them had children who struggled the way Thomas had struggled. Furthermore, Briggs continued, turning his gaze directly on Randolph. "We've all noticed that Cassidy's boy needs special tutoring. Makes you wonder if the problem isn't the teaching method. Maybe it's that some children were coddled without a mother's guidance." The implication hung heavy in the room. Thomas needed help because Randolph had failed as a father. His judgment was suspect. His endorsement of Ellen's methods proved nothing except his own inadequacy. Blood pounded in Randolph's temples. He stood slowly, feeling every eye turned toward him. "My son receives tutoring because Mrs. Hartwell offered and I accepted. His progress has been exceptional." "Exceptional," Briggs scoffed. "Or just brought up to where he should have been all along if he'd been raised with proper discipline." "Gentlemen," Morris interrupted, "we should focus on the teaching methods themselves, not individual families." But the damage was done. The room had divided into camps, those who valued traditional authority versus those willing to consider different approaches. Randolph found himself alone in the middle, caught between pride and truth. "I move we vote tonight," Briggs said. "Replace Mrs. Hartwell with a qualified male teacher who understands that children need firm guidance, not coddling." "Second," someone called. Morris looked at Randolph. "You've been quiet. Mr. Cassidy, as our largest contributor to the school fund, your opinion carries weight." Randolph thought of Thomas reading by lamplight, excited about science experiments, thought of Ellen's patient wisdom, her refusal to shame children for learning differently. He thought of his own rigid certainty crumbling under the weight of evidence. "I authorized Mrs. Hartwell's methods for my son," he said carefully, "as his father. I claim the right to choose his education. I see no reason to interfere with her teaching." It was a qualified defense at best. He didn't endorse her philosophy or argue for its superiority. He simply claimed parental authority, but it was enough to prevent immediate action. Morris tabled the vote for further discussion, and the meeting dissolved into uncomfortable conversations. Randolph left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Outside, spring rain had started cold and insistent, turning the street to mud. By week's end, the social consequences became clear. Men who'd sought his railroad investments now hesitated. Dinner invitations dried up. At the Mercantile, conversation stopped when he entered. Luther Briggs made sure everyone knew that Randolph Cassidy couldn't control his own son and wouldn't defend traditional values when challenged. Randolph stood at his office window, watching rain hammer the schoolhouse roof. Inside, Ellen taught children who would go home to fathers who wanted her fired. He'd defended her right to teach his son, but he hadn't defended her methods or her wisdom. He'd protected his choice without having the courage to say his choice was right. The rain continued through the night, washing away the last remnants of winter, but bringing no clarity, only mud and cold, and the sound of water. Finding new paths through resistant ground. By late May, Thomas had transformed so completely that Randolph sometimes forgot the boy who'd struggled with reading just months earlier. His son now carried books everywhere, reading during meals until told to stop. He'd made a friend another student who thrived under Ellen's individual attention, and the two spent hours discussing science and history. Most remarkable, Thomas volunteered to present a project to the entire school. Randolph attended with mixed feelings. The other parents would be watching, judging, comparing their traditionally taught children against his son who needed special treatment. Thomas stood at the front of the classroom, surrounded by a model railroad he'd built from wood and wire. "The Transcontinental Railroad changed everything," he began, voice steady. "It connected families separated by distance. It brought supplies to settlements. It made America smaller and bigger at the same time." He explained engineering concepts with clarity that impressed even Randolph. Discussed economic impact using mathematics he'd learned through Ellen's visual methods. Connected railroad history to westward expansion, to family stories, to the very town they lived in. When he finished, silence held for a moment. Then Ellen started applause that spread through the room. Randolph's chest tightened with pride, and something more painful recognition that his harsh methods had been burying this capability all along. Afterward, parents clustered in small groups. Some approached Ellen with questions about her teaching. Others stood with Luther Briggs, shaking their heads at the performance they'd witnessed. Randolph heard Briggs mutter, "Special treatment can make anyone look good." He wanted to argue, wanted to defend his son's genuine achievement, wanted to tell Briggs that Thomas had learned more in 3 months with Ellen than in 3 years of traditional schooling. But defending Thomas meant defending Ellen's methods, and defending her methods meant admitting his own had been wrong. That evening, alone in his study, Randolph faced the crisis he'd been avoiding for weeks. His son thrived. That was undeniable. Ellen's methods worked. Also undeniable. His traditional approach had been failing Thomas. Equally undeniable. He had to choose admit error or cling to being right. Pride said to hold firm, maintain ideology, protect reputation. Evidence said something entirely different. Randolph thought of Rachel. Dead these 10 years. She would have known what Thomas needed, would have seen past rigid rules to the child underneath, would have chosen love over correctness every single time. He'd been trying to honor her memory by being strong, but maybe real strength meant admitting weakness. The decision crystallized with painful clarity. Thomas deserved better than a father too proud to learn. The town deserved better than educational methods that helped only children who fit a single mold. Ellen deserved better than qualified defense from a man too stubborn to admit when he was wrong. The next afternoon, Randolph appeared at the schoolhouse during Ellen's planning hour. She looked up from papers spread across her desk. "Mr. Cassidy, I need to ask you something." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "How did you know Thomas could learn when I'd given up? When his previous teacher had given up, how did you see what we missed?" Ellen set down her pen. "I never saw a failing child. Mr. Cassidy, I saw a bright boy being taught in a language he didn't speak. So I learned his language instead of demanding he learn mine." The simplicity of it broke something in Randolph's chest. "That's what I should have done," he said quietly. "Learned his language. Instead, I insisted he learn mine, and called it discipline when he couldn't. You love your son. That's clear in everything you do. Love isn't enough if it's expressed in ways that hurt instead of help." Ellen studied him with those steady gray eyes. "Would you like to stay for the tutoring session? See how Thomas learns best?" Randolph nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. For the next hour, He watched Ellen teach his son with patience and precision. Watched her adapt instantly when Thomas struggled, finding new approaches until comprehension clicked. Watched his son flourish under a tension that saw him as an individual, not a problem. Walked out into late spring sunshine, everything in bloom, world full of wildflowers and possibility. His pride had nearly cost his son a future. But love, real love, the kind that chose truth over being right, offered a different path forward. Summer approached. Decisions needed making. Randolph finally knew which choice to make. The announcement appeared in the Settlers Ridge Gazette on the first Monday of June's special town meeting. Thursday evening. All residents welcome. Randolph had paid for the announcement himself. Had also paid for construction to begin on a new school building larger. Designed with individual learning spaces, funded entirely from his railroad fortune. Thursday evening. The meeting hall overflowed. News of Randolph Cassidy's mysterious announcement had drawn everyone from ranchers to shopkeepers. Curious about what the railroad tycoon had planned, Randolph stood at the front, palms sweating despite years of public speaking about business ventures. This was different. This required humility instead of authority. Luther Briggs sat in the front row, arms crossed, expression skeptical. Ellen Hartwell stood in back, surprise evident on her face. He hadn't warned her, hadn't wanted her to talk him out of what needed doing. "Thank you all for coming," Randolph began. "I called this meeting to make a public statement about our school and its future." He paused, gathering courage that had built railroads across mountains but faltered before simple truth. 3 months ago, I stood before the town council and called Mrs. Hartwell's teaching methods nonsense. I said children needed discipline, not coddling. I dismissed her approach as soft thinking unsuited for frontier life. The room went silent. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Randolph pressed forward before doubt could stop him. My son was failing under traditional methods. Mrs. Hartwell offered to help, and I refused out of pride. When I finally allowed her to tutor Thomas, he transformed. Not because she lowered standards, but because she raised them in ways he could actually reach. He met Briggs's eyes directly. "You said my son needed special treatment because I coddled him without a mother. The truth is harder. I failed him by demanding he learn in ways his mind doesn't work." Mrs. Hartwell succeeded where I failed, not through softness, but through wisdom. Someone in back called out, "What are you proposing?" "Cassidy, I'm proposing we stop pretending one teaching method serves all children. I'm funding a new school building designed for Mrs. Hartwell's approach, individual learning spaces, resources for different types of learners, room for teachers trained in her methods." He turned to Ellen. "If you'll accept the position, I'd like you to lead this school and train others in your philosophy." Ellen's eyes widened. "Mr. Cassidy, I'm also proposing something more personal." He crossed the room to stand before her, aware of every watching eye. "I've spent 3 months watching you teach my son. Spent 3 months learning that wisdom comes in forms I didn't recognize. I wonder if you'd allow me to court you properly, not as the man who fought your methods, but as one who wants to learn from them." The room erupted in whispers. Ellen's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "This isn't a business proposition," Randolph continued. "This is me asking if you'd give me the chance to become a better man than I've been. A better father. A better partner to someone who sees clearly what I missed." Ellen was quiet for a long moment. "Then what changed your mind, Mr. Cassidy? My son reading by lamplight because he loves it, not because I forced him. Watching him explain complex ideas with confidence I'd tried to beat into him through discipline. Realizing that strength sometimes wears gentleness. And the hardest discipline is admitting when you're wrong." She smiled, then a genuine smile that softened her whole face. "I'll accept your school proposal. And I'll accept your courtship, on one condition. Name it. Help me prove to this town that different methods serve different children. Not just with money, but with conviction. You have my word." The meeting dissolved into conversation, some supportive, others skeptical, but Randolph barely noticed. He was watching Ellen smile, feeling the weight of pride finally lift from his shoulders. Luther Briggs stood and left without comment. Others followed, but more stayed, approaching Ellen with questions about their own struggling children. Outside, summer stars emerged in a clear sky. Everything bloomed wildflowers and possibility both. Randolph had built an empire on being right. Tonight, he'd found something more valuable in being wrong. The wedding took place on a Saturday in July, in the new school building that smelled of fresh pine and possibility. Thomas stood beside his father as witness, grinning so widely his face must have hurt. Ellen wore a simple dress the color of creek water, wildflowers woven through her auburn hair. The ceremony was brief. Randolph spoke vows that promised partnership, respect, and the humility to keep learning. Ellen promised wisdom, patience, and the courage to challenge him when love demanded it. When the minister pronounced them married, Thomas cheered before anyone else could react. Laughter rippled through the small gathering friends and supporters who believed children deserved teachers, who saw them clearly. The reception spilled into the schoolyard. Tables held food contributed by families whose children thrived under Ellen's methods. Music came from a fiddle player who'd once doubted her but changed his mind when his daughter learned to read. Randolph watched Ellen move through the crowd, stopping to talk with each child, remembering details about their interests and struggles. She'd already hired 2 additional teachers, women from back east trained in progressive methods. The school would open in September with space for individual learning, group projects, and approaches that met children where they lived. Thomas appeared at his elbow. "Are you happy?" "Papa, very happy, son." "Mrs. Hartwell, I mean. Mother says I can help organize the science materials for next term." Randolph smiled at his son's correction. The easy way mother had already entered his vocabulary. "That sounds perfect." Later, as the reception wound down, Randolph and Ellen stood together watching the sun set over Settlers Ridge. The town his railroad had built now held a school his wife would transform. "Regrets?" Ellen asked. "Only that I didn't listen to you sooner." "You listened when it mattered." She took his hand. "Some people never do." Randolph thought of the men who'd voted against Ellen, who still believed traditional methods were the only acceptable approach. Luther Briggs had enrolled his sons in a boarding school rather than accept progressive teaching. "We won't reach everyone," he said. "We don't need to reach everyone. Just enough to prove that children thrive when teaching meets them as individuals, not problems to be fixed." From inside the school came Thomas's voice, reading aloud to younger children with the confidence of someone who'd discovered his own capability. Other children listened, rapt, learning that stories could be adventures instead of punishments. Ellen squeezed Randolph's hand. "Your wealth built the building. But what we fill it with, that's wisdom, partnership, and love, recognizing no single path serves all travelers." Randolph pulled her close, marveling at how completely his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd stood rigid in his certainty, dismissing her methods as nonsense. Tonight, he stood beside her as partner and student both, still learning, still growing. The summer sky deepened to purple, stars emerging one by one. Inside the school, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming. Children's laughter drifted through open windows. His office across town stood dark ledgers perfectly aligned, everything in its place. But here, in this building full of books and potential, disorder served a higher purpose. Individual learning plans replaced rigid rows. Patient attention replaced harsh discipline. And children thrived. Thomas ran out, trailed by his friend. "Papa, Mother, can we show everyone the constellation charts?" "Of course," Ellen said. The boys disappeared back inside, through the window. Randolph watched his son point at a star chart, explaining patterns with enthusiasm that would have been impossible before Ellen's gentle revolution. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For seeing what I couldn't. For teaching Thomas when I didn't know how. For being patient with a stubborn man who confused pride with strength." Ellen turned in his arms. "Thank you for having the courage to change. Not everyone can admit error, even when evidence demands it." They stood together as evening deepened to night, summer warmth still radiating from the earth. Their school glowed like a lantern in the darkness. Inside, children learned. Outside, stars wheeled overhead. And in the space between rigid tradition and reckless innovation, wisdom and wealth combined to create something neither could have built alone. Randolph had thought his greatest accomplishment was the railroad connecting Settlers Ridge to the wider world. But this transformation of how children were seen and taught and loved, this would endure long after his tracks rusted, not through force or dominance, but through the gentle revolution of meeting children where they were and teaching them in languages they could understand. The proof stood before him, reading by lamplight, eyes bright with discovery. His son, their future. The evidence that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is admit he was wrong and learn a better way from someone wiser.